She was just another invisible badge in a giant corporation. No one listened. No one saw her. Until one day, in silence, she did something that changed everything. When everyone else went quiet in the face of injustice, it was her presence, steady, discreet, and brave, that became the heart of a revolution. No title, no spotlight, just a strength no power could silence. And the most unexpected part? The most powerful man in the company ended up learning the hardest lesson of all, how to truly listen until the very end. This isn't just a love story, it's a story about staying, about courage, about everything that's born in silence. Stay until the end, because what happens when two souls recognize each other through listening might move your heart in a way you never saw coming. If stories like this speak to you, subscribe now. Here, every video is a reminder that true love doesn't shout. It listens and chooses to stay. The Montgomery Enterprises building was made of mirrored glass and accumulated silences. Inside, Claire Bennett walked the halls like someone who had long learned how to go unnoticed. She was good at what she did, maybe even great, but she never had a voice in meetings, nor an invitation to the 35th floor coffee breaks. Her badge was blue, which meant operational staff, which also meant expendable. Still, she showed up early every day with her tea mug, her worn notebook, and her dignity intact. Some called it stubbornness. She called it principle. That morning, the ground floor was more restless than usual. Whispers ran through the corridors, eyes glanced away from screens, and even the security guard seemed more alert. Claire picked up fragments, fraud, leaked documents, important client involved. She wasn't in marketing, but she'd been at the company long enough to know when something was wrong. Her chest tightened with instinct. She opened the internal email system and found a terse notice. All external communication must be authorized by the board. Avoid comments. Enforced silence. But Claire knew, when everyone goes quiet, someone has to speak. While the higher-ups locked themselves in meeting rooms, Claire did what she always did, observed. Truth lived in the details. She saw a normally cheerful executive biting his nails, saw the president's assistant deleting emails with trembling hands, saw an intern dismissed in silence, guilty or scapegoat. Claire didn't have all the pieces, but she knew when a system was starting to rot from the inside. And she also knew this. Silence born of fear feeds the lie. That stirred something deeper than her job title. It touched who she was. At lunch, while most of her co-workers left the building, Claire sat alone in the shared lounge. Her coffee had gone cold, and her notebook was filling with scribbles, arrows, and connections. It was her habit, write everything down, even if no one asked, even if no one would read it. That's how she pieced together a dangerous puzzle, details that anyone else might miss. And there, in the middle of anonymous pages, courage was born. What do you do when no one else dares? You become the voice, even knowing the cost. That same afternoon, Claire logged into the company intranet and sent an anonymous report through the ethics channel. She included snippets of conversations, data analysis, and technical observations. She didn't have undeniable proof, but it was enough to raise uncomfortable questions. When she hit send, her palms were sweaty, not from fear of being discovered, but from doubt. Would anyone care? Deep down, she didn't expect heroism. She just hoped someone, somewhere, still cared about what was right. Then she closed the notebook, took a sip of lukewarm tea, and went back to work. Across the building, in the upper floors that smelled of leather and ego, the mood was tense. Ethan Montgomery, the reclusive CEO, was frowning over the internal reports. His past made him suspicious of everyone. Ever since his brother died in a scandal that nearly ruined the family, Ethan had lived behind closed doors and carefully measured words. His name still appeared on magazine covers, but he no longer recognized himself in them. Receiving a report like this, so detailed and direct, lit something dormant in him. He didn't know who sent it, but he wanted to find out. Ethan didn't delegate. He read everything carefully, took notes, asked questions, and finally, he went down, alone. It was rare to see the CEO off the 35th floor, but that afternoon he walked the lower halls, scanning faces. He wasn't sure what he was looking for, just knew he needed to be there, where things happened, without recognition. And in that quiet search, his eyes briefly met Claire's. She didn't look away. That surprised him. Most people averted their eyes in his presence. But not her. She kept typing, as if she owed no one anything but that moment. Ethan didn't know he had just found the woman who would change everything. He only felt a flicker of curiosity. Claire, on her side, noticed him, but kept her rhythm. She continued reviewing reports with the same focus, as if there were no difference between her and the owner of the company. And to her, there wasn't. People are people. Ethics are ethics. And no one, no matter how rich, is above what's right. But that night, walking home, Claire felt something shift in the air. As if invisible gears were finally starting to move, as the elevator rose. Claire leaned her forehead against the cold metal wall. She felt the weight of solitary courage. She knew that if she were found out, there would be no applause, only backlash. She wasn't naive, but she also wasn't complicit. Arriving at her small apartment in a Boston suburb, she made a simple soup, lit a candle, and wrote at the top of the next notebook page, "The truth doesn't need to be accepted by everyone to still be the truth." And she smiled, because even invisible, she still had a voice. And she had used it. The next morning, the company was in turmoil. An official memo announced that the CEO himself would lead the internal investigation. The guilty parties were being looked into, and Claire's name was still missing. She remained invisible, but she felt something realigning. Then something unexpected, an email from the president's office requesting her presence at a technical review of internal processes. In 6 years, no one had ever asked for her input. It smelled like a trap or an opportunity. She took a deep breath and clicked confirm. The meeting would be later that day in room 18B, a neutral space on the 22nd floor, far from the powerful and distant from the operatives. Claire arrived right on time, wearing her usual simple clothes, dark pants, a pale blue shirt, and a necklace with a leaf pendant. It was her mother's. Upon entering, she found 3 people already seated, 2 department managers, and a man she had never seen up close. It was Ethan, standing, alone, no suit, no usual coldness, and he was looking at her as if waiting for an answer. "Claire Bennett?" he asked, pretending not to know, but clearly knowing. She nodded, visibly surprised. The managers exchanged glances. "Thank you for accepting the invitation," Ethan said, then asked the others to leave. Claire hesitated. "You can relax. This is just a conversation." But something in his tone went deeper than protocol. It was as if he said, "It's safe to be yourself here." And coming from a CEO, that was stranger than any fraud accusation. "I read a report yesterday. Very well written, very detailed. Almost invisible," Ethan began, resting his hands on the chair in front of her. Claire kept her gaze steady. "It seems to have come from someone who sees more than the rest, and yet stays silent." Silence. "Why now?" he asked. Claire swallowed hard. She could lie, pretend, or speak, because sometimes silence starts to scream, she said, and in that instant, Ethan felt something stronger than admiration. He felt shaken, because this woman had no power, and yet said everything he didn't have the courage to admit. That he pulled the chair out, sat down, and for a moment, he was just a man talking to a woman. No titles, no badges. "And what else has silence been telling you, Claire?" She looked at him with the calm eyes of someone who had seen too much injustice to be intimidated by a tie. "That people here talk a lot, but listen very little. That high-ranking titles confuse respect with fear, and that if the truth makes someone uncomfortable, it's probably because they're benefiting from the lie." Ethan leaned back slowly. This woman was dangerous, because she spoke truths without raising her voice. And truths like that are impossible to ignore. They sat in silence for a moment. Claire adjusted her notebook on the table, as if to say, "Everything you're looking for is here, but maybe you don't want to see it." Ethan noticed the notebook. "You write everything down, everything that matters, even if no one reads it." He leaned in slightly, curious. "What if I want to read it?" Claire smiled, not arrogantly. "Then that would be a start." At the end of the conversation, Ethan thanked her, formally, but his eyes said something else. They said, "You've shaken me out of autopilot." Claire left the room with the peace of someone who had simply done what was right. But something inside her had shifted. A subtle line was being drawn between her and that man. Not of hierarchy, but of listening. And deep down, she knew. Real encounters don't begin with intentions, they begin with presence. And this definitely wasn't just another day.in. The room, Ethan remained alone. He ran his fingers over the notebook she had left behind. Maybe on purpose, maybe not. He read a sentence written in the corner of the last page. Maybe we're not invisible. Maybe we're just surrounded by people who don't know how to see. He closed the notebook slowly, took a deep breath, and for the first time in years, he smiled. But it was a quiet smile, like someone who just found something precious and doesn't yet know what to do with it. In the days that followed, Claire went back to her routine, but the company wasn't the same. Her colleagues whispered, "Did you hear? The girl from quality was called upstairs." Some were suspicious. Others praised her behind closed doors. But no one dared ask her directly. Claire, as always, didn't explain. She just worked harder, and every time she passed the central elevator, she remembered his eyes and thought, "Is someone up there, finally listening?" Ethan, meanwhile, was reviewing reports, firing those who covered up mistakes, and looking at the data with fresh eyes. But there was something beyond the spreadsheets that filled his thoughts, something beyond the metrics. A woman with a blue notebook and truths that couldn't be bought. She reminded him of who he was before the trauma, before he shut every window of his soul. And maybe, just maybe, he was ready to open one again. Night fell over Boston, carrying the scent of rain and promises. Claire walked home with steady steps. Even though she was tired at her doorstep, she found an envelope taped to the knob. Inside, a printed message on company letterhead. "Voices that don't shout still deserve to be heard." Yem. Claire looked up at the cloudy sky and smiled. The world could still be harsh, but maybe, just maybe, it had started to listen. At Montgomery Enterprises, it was said that Ethan Montgomery only left the 35th floor when the world was on the verge of collapse. And for many, that week felt exactly like that. The CEO's decisions were faster, the board more tense, and the hallways quieter than usual. Longtime employees whispered that ever since Lucas, Ethan's younger brother, had died, he rarely spoke to anyone without filtering them through at least 3 levels of trust. But now, something was different. He was paying closer attention. He was looking for more than numbers. He was looking for people. As reports piled up on the executive marble desk, Ethan stared at a blank sheet of paper. He couldn't stop thinking about the woman on the 10th floor. It wasn't just her clarity in seeing the company. It was the way she said everything without raising her voice. The way she remained whole, even in a place that treated her as expendable. It was new to him, disarming, and in some place he didn't dare name. Admirable. Claire, on her side, tried to keep her usual pace. But she was no longer invisible. She was seen, too much, by some, and observed closely by the one pair of eyes that actually mattered. She wasn't seeking recognition, but she knew she was now on the radar of someone powerful. That unsettled her, not out of fear, but because she didn't know what would come next. She had learned early on that when power draws near to the small, it either wants to swallow or to learn. And she didn't yet know which would be the case. 2 days after the meeting with Ethan, Claire received a new invitation to participate in a special technical review on internal process integrity. But this time, she had access to the 35th floor. She read the email 3 times. It was official, a temporary credential, a security code, and a message in the footer. "Your ability to listen is more valuable than you know." Executive Board. Claire took a deep breath, adjusted her bag on her shoulder, and went up. As the elevator doors opened, she noticed the different scent of new carpet, polished wood, and perfectly calibrated air conditioning. It felt like entering another world, one where time moved slower, or where decisions accelerated the fate of thousands. She was greeted by a smiling assistant and led to a large conference room with windows overlooking the entire city. But she wasn't impressed, because to Claire, it wasn't the view that mattered. It was what people were truly willing to see. Ethan arrived a few minutes later. No suit, sleeves rolled up, leather folder in hand. And that gaze, the one that seemed to see through any armored. "Claire," he said, with a small nod. "Mr. Montgomery." "Ethan, please," she nodded. "I'd like your help understanding where we've gone wrong. Not as a CEO, as someone who might have stopped listening." And then, for the first time, she realized he wasn't just curious. He was willing. The conversation lasted over an hour. Claire pointed out failures in internal Processes, subtle ethical lapses, postures that quietly corroded the company's foundation. Ethan listened without interruption. He took notes, asked questions, agreed. At one point, she said, "A culture of fear is silent, but it screams through small actions," and it struck him like an arrow, because he knew. He had lived that with his brother. Lucas had tried to change things and was silenced. Maybe that's why Claire got to him so deeply. It was as if, without knowing it, she was continuing what Lucas never had the chance to finish. After the meeting, Ethan walked to the window, hands in his pockets. "Did you know my brother worked here?" Claire shook her head, surprised. Lucas. He believed the company could be more than numbers. That listening to ignored voices was a way forward. She waited in silence. "He died in an accident days after submitting a report like yours. I never knew if it was coincidence or consequence." Claire's stomach turned. Ethan slowly turned to her. "I never had the courage to look at those voices again. Until now." The words hung in the air like something sacred. Claire didn't respond. With rehearsed phrases, she simply looked at him with a mix of respect and shared pain. For a moment, they had crossed the social mirror that divided them. He, a guarded CEO. She, a blue badge employee. And there they were, two wounded human beings trying to find a way not to repeat the past. And maybe, to build something different. That afternoon, Claire returned to the 10th floor, her notebook pressed to her chest. She felt something shifting, and it wasn't just within the company. It was inside her, and inside him too. There was real risk in their growing closeness. But there was also something she had never felt before, truly being heard. For the first time, Claire didn't feel she had to prove anything. And that was freeing. That night, Ethan stayed in his office longer than usual. The city beyond the window looked like a chessboard of quiet lights. He reread the notes Claire had made. They weren't just data, they were signs of a sick system, disguised as efficiency. For the first time, he wondered how long it had been since he truly saw. Maybe he never had. Claire, with her calm voice and eyes that didn't flinch, had broken something open inside him. And unlike what he expected, he didn't want to run from it. Across the city, Claire was washing the dinner dishes, her hands still cold. She tried to distract herself with music, but her thoughts ran wild. Not about Ethan's power, but about what he'd revealed about his brother. That confession wasn't just personal, it was a warning. Claire knew that when you get involved with truths too big, you also attract risk. But something in the way Ethan had opened up made it clear he wouldn't use her. Not this time. And that, in a world like theirs, was already extraordinary. The next day, Claire found an envelope on her desk. Inside was an invitation to a new initiative, Active Listening, Internal Ethics Reform Program. And her name was listed as one of the coordinators for the pilot project. Alongside it, a handwritten note. Only those who understand the value of silence can truly listen. She took a deep breath, moved. It was more than a promotion. It was recognition and an invitation to build something she had only dared to dream of. When she returned to the 35th floor for the project meeting, Claire felt the curious and some envious stares. She wasn't intimidated. She carried her blue notebook and a quiet confidence that didn't come from ego, but from conviction. When she walked into the room, Ethan was already there, wearing a soft smile. "Thank you for accepting." "I didn't accept for you. I accepted for the company, and for the voices still waiting to be heard." Ethan nodded, respectful. They didn't know it yet, but that was the beginning of a silent revolution. During the meeting, other employees from different departments were brought in, people who were rarely heard. Ethan remained silent for most of it, watching as Claire led with ease and empathy. She knew how to mediate, how to listen, how to make others feel seen. And more than anything, she knew how to turn emotion into direction. When the meeting ended, he walked her to the elevator. Before she stepped in, he spoke softly. "Do you have any idea what you're doing here?" Claire smiled slightly. "I do. And for the first time, that both scares and motivates me. In the following days, the two began to cross paths more frequently, sometimes for work reasons, other times through carefully unexplained coincidences. Quick lunches, email exchanges, small notes tucked between files. Ethan, so used to controlling everything, found himself drawn to the natural way Claire navigated uncomfortable truths. She, in turn, still kept her emotional distance, not out of arrogance, but because she knew how easily someone like him could undo everything she was building. If he wasn't truly ready. One rainy night, they ended up alone again. The power had gone out due to an external issue. Only essential generators were running. Ethan and Claire were in the central file room when the lights went out. The emergency glow bathed the space in warm amber tones. "Looks like we're stuck," she said, trying to sound calmed. "At least it's not the elevator," he replied with a half smile. And in that brief instant, something shifted between them. Not because of the darkness, but because the walls had finally come down. "Are you afraid of trusting?" Claire asked suddenly, into the silence. "I'm afraid of losing again," he answered. Without hesitation, she looked at him, with tenderness, but not pitied. "I've lost too. But I learned that sometimes, loss is what teaches us how to stay." Ethan looked at her intently. For the first time, he saw not just an ethical employee, but a whole woman. With scars, with choices, with a presence that couldn't be ignored. And he knew he was starting to get lost in her. When the power returned, they lingered a few seconds longer than necessary. The world around them resumed its rhythm. But inside them, something had slowed down. "I should get back," Claire said. "Me too," but neither moved. Until she smiled, with that same serene tone. "Be careful with women you don't notice coming." And she walked away. Ethan stayed. And for the first time, he wished she'd come back. That night, Claire arrived home and wrote a single sentence in her blue notebook. "When the right eyes finally see you, the world no longer needs to change, because you've already started to change from within." Across the city, Ethan leaned back in his office chair and reread her last message that he knew there was still a long road between them. But for the first time, he wanted to walk it. Mornings at Montgomery Enterprises had changed. The elevators now carried more expectation than urgency. Employees who once didn't dare to speak up were beginning to look at each other with more courage. And at the heart of this quiet change was a woman with steady steps and a blue notebook in hand. Claire wasn't one for speeches, but her constant presence and listening gestures spoke louder than any memo. She didn't want to change the world. She just wanted it to stop crushing the ones no one ever heard. Ethan found himself reorganizing his schedule more and more just to run into her. Sometimes, he made up meetings just to pass through the lower floors. Other times, he waited for her in the cafeteria, pretending it was coincidence. But there was something genuine in his presence. He didn't try to impress her, didn't make promises or use power as currency. He simply was. And Claire, who had always braced for confrontation, didn't quite know how to respond to someone who simply stayed, silent, but attentive. One morning, she arrived early and found a plain envelope on her desk with no sender. Inside was a ticket to a talk on corporate ethics and a note. "Maybe you should be on stage. But for now, how about listening to those who also dared to challenge the system?" Claire held the note for a few seconds, a faint smile on her lips. Ethan didn't try to woo her with flowers. He offered presence. And for someone like her, that was far rarer. Days later, on a particularly chaotic afternoon, Claire was taking the elevator to the 12th floor when it stopped between levels. A power glitch. Emergency lights flickered on. She took a deep breath. She was used to handling setbacks. But then she heard a familiar voice. "Great. And today of all days, I decided not to take the stairs." It was Ethan, standing beside her. No security, no protocol, just him, trapped with her in a metallic cube of silence. They both smiled discreetly, like people who knew that some coincidences weren't really coincidences. "Do you always show up when the system fails?" she teased. "I am the system, remember?" he replied, with a restrained smile. The light flickered again. The elevator radio crackled. Then silence. A long, loaded silence. One that would make most uncomfortable. But for them, it was almost familiar. It was as if, finally, there was no distraction from what truly mattered. Presence. Claire leaned against the wall, notebook still in her hands. Ethan watched. "Do you always carry that with you?" "Always. Can I see it?" She hesitated for a moment, then handed it over. "Don't go looking for what you're not ready to understand." He nodded, almost in reverence, and began flipping through slowly. The pages were filled with diagrams, loose words, phrases scribbled in corners. There was pain there, but also hope. On one page, he read, "It's not about being noticed. It's about not letting what's right die in silence. And it struck him more than any lecture he'd ever attended. This notebook is worth more than a dozen of the company's reports, Claire whispered, maybe because it wasn't made to impress anyone, just to remind me of what really matters. The elevator still didn't move. The air felt heavier, not from lack of oxygen, but from proximity. Claire was inches from Ethan, but there was no fear in the tension, just curiosity, maybe admiration. He, for his part, had never felt so at ease in an uncontrolled moment. "You're not afraid of me, are you?" he asked, almost disbelieving. Claire met his eyes. "No. Why not?" "Because you're more afraid than you let on. And because I've survived people far more dangerous than you." The words landed deep in Ethan. It wasn't a challenge. It was a fact. She saw through his armor, and that disarmed him even more. For a moment, he wanted to tell her everything. About the absent father, the mother who stayed silent, the guilt over his brother's death. But he couldn't. Instead, he spoke softly. "I've hidden behind titles, decisions, silence," Claire finished. "Because you thought speaking would only make things worse." Ethan looked at her, surprised. She already knew, even if he hadn't said it. When the elevator finally resumed, they didn't move right away. The doors opened, and they remained. A few seconds longer, as if the real world had returned too quickly, as if, in that in-between space, they had lived something words couldn't define. Claire took her notebook back, carefully. "Thank you for not trying to understand everything." Ethan smiled. Sometimes, just being there is enough, and for the first time, Claire believed he meant it. That night, Claire got home with her thoughts spinning. It wasn't the elevator. It wasn't coincidence. It was the way Ethan was starting to look at her, not like a useful employee, but as someone he respected, and maybe admired. She wasn't naive. She knew the risks of letting herself be drawn to someone so powerful, but she also knew how to recognize when someone's presence didn't seek control, only connection. And that confused her more than any eloquent speech ever could. Ethan, on the other hand, stayed late at the office, scribbling phrases he couldn't explain. He remembered the page in her notebook that read, "When silence is real, it becomes presence." Claire was making him question everything he thought he knew about leadership, about strength, even about masculinity. It was strange to want to lower his guard. Stranger still was liking the feeling. He didn't want to win her over. He wanted to know her, and he wasn't sure if that scared him or set him free. The next day, Claire found a cup of coffee on her desk with a handwritten lid bearing her name. No note, no explanation, just the warm drink and his handwriting. She looked around, suspicious, but saw no one. She smiled to herself. It wasn't an extravagant gesture. It was subtle, nearly invisible. But it was also the first time in years someone remembered her name with no ulterior motive. And that moved her more than she wanted to admit. Throughout the week, they kept meeting in boardrooms, narrow hallways, and quiet cafes. The energy between them was hard to define. There were no promises, no games, just a slow, real exchange. Ethan listened. Claire challenged. And every time she spoke a hard truth, he didn't flinch. Listening became a bond. And the bond, a path with no name. But when they were both already walking on a gray afternoon, Claire found Ethan in the company cafeteria. He was alone, a book open before him, brow furrowed. "Corporate philosophy?" she asked, tray in hand, trying to understand how to change a culture without losing the company. "You're not going to change it alone. That's why I need you." She looked at him, serious. "Don't confuse this with whatever's growing between us." Ethan took a deep breath. What if that's exactly why it could work? The words hung in the air like steam from hot tea. Claire sat beside him but kept a respectful distance. "We don't even know if we're ready to trust." "And how do we know?" she answered firmly. "When, even without knowing how it ends, we choose to stay." Ethan looked at her like someone hearing a long-buried truth. Maybe that was it. Love, if it came, wouldn't be born of promises, but of presence. At the end of that week, Claire was surprised by an unexpected invitation. Ethan had asked her to attend an external board meeting as part of the company's new ethics initiative. It was the first time a base-level employee would represent Montgomery in such a setting. Many colleagues scoffed. Others quietly congratulated her. But she knew this wasn't an honor. It was a responsibility. And she would carry it with the same firmness she had always given to her blue notebook. During the trip, Claire and Ethan shared a car to the headquarters of a partner foundation. On the way, they talked about childhood, books, and Ethan's brother. There were shy laughs and comfortable silences. At one point, Claire spoke about her mother, a public school teacher, and her father, who used to say, "The people who change the world the most are the ones who rarely appear in the photos." Ethan replied, "I wish my father had said something like that." Claire gently touched his arm, a brief gesture, but in that moment, everything changed. On the return, stuck in unexpected traffic under a golden sky, Ethan broke the silence. "Have you ever thought about leaving here? Starting something of your own?" Claire took a moment before answering. "I have. But I always felt like there was still something to be done before leaving. And now?" She looked at him, eyes calmed. "Now I think, maybe that something is you." And then she turned her gaze away, letting the sentence hang, like someone planting a seed. That night, when she got home, Claire wrote on a fresh page of her notebook, "He still has walls, but for the first time, he left the door ajar." Ethan, meanwhile, set his phone aside and ignored the emails. He just stared at the sky through the window and thought, "She hears me like no one else, and I'm starting to want to deserve that." What neither of them knew yet was that the outside world wouldn't let this silence bloom without first testing everything they were building. What begins as a silent transformation eventually unsettles those who profit from the noise of injustice. And that's exactly what happened. Claire's presence in external meetings, her ethical proposals, and the new active listening channel sparked applause from some and fury from others. The executive board was divided. Some saw her as a threat, others a temporary nuisance. But no one, absolutely no one, imagined that the woman with the blue badge could become the trigger for a national crisis. It all started with a fake dossier. It circulated quietly among upper management, containing veiled accusations against Claire, conflict of interest, misuse of internal information, destabilizing behavior. The document reached a sensationalist journalist who published an article suggesting Claire was using her recent position to benefit third parties. The news went viral. Old photos, taken out of context, were used to support the narrative. Within hours, Claire, who had never sought the spotlight, was exposed to the entire country as if she were guilty. She received the news while organizing materials for a project in one of the training rooms. When she opened her phone, she saw her face on headlines she never wanted to star in. The ground disappeared beneath her. Her hands trembled, not from fear of guilt, but from the cruel feeling of being betrayed by a system that, for a brief moment, had pretended to be changing. Employees glanced at her sideways. The trust she had just begun to earn slipped through her fingers, and once again, she found herself alone. Ethan was in a video conference when his assistant rushed in with the news. The color drained from his face. He immediately called off the meeting. He read everything, every line, every lie, and then, for the first time in a long while, he lost control. He threw the tablet against the wall, took a deep breath, and called for the legal team. Find out where this came from. Now, but deep down, he already knew someone on the board was behind it. And this was personal. While the lawyers mobilized, Ethan descended the building with firm steps, his heart at war. He found Claire in the lobby, being escorted by security. They were following preventive guidelines, pending the investigation. She clutched her notebook to her chest, as if holding something more precious than any title. "This is a mistake," he told the head of security. "Board's orders," the man replied. Claire, eyes steady, spoke softly. "Don't try to protect me, Ethan. Not now. Just look out for me. And keep going." She exited through the side door, under the gaze of onlookers and cowards. Ethan stood still, feeling broken. Everything he had tried to build was crumbling before his eyes. But what devastated him wasn't the blow to the company's image. It was the blow to the woman who had taught him how to listen. He didn't know how to prove her innocence, but he knew that if he stayed silent now, he'd be complicit. And he made himself a promise. He would not repeat the mistakes of the past. He would not let fear silence the truth. Claire returned home. In silence. She didn't turn on the TV or check social media. She just took off her shoes, sat on the floor, and opened her notebook. She wrote a single sentence. "It hurts more to be betrayed by those you thought were finally listening." But she wasn't referring to Ethan. Because, even wounded, she knew He wouldn't throw her to the wolves. Not with that look. Not with that silence. Not with that listening that once made her believe it might be possible to exist there, without having to scream. The next day, Ethan called a press conference against everyone's advice. The partners demanded silence, but he looked straight at the camera. One of the most ethical employees to ever walk through this company is being attacked by voices that never tolerated real listening. And if they think I'll let them silence Claire Bennett, then they don't know me. His statement sparked mixed reactions. Some applauded him. Others accused him of emotional involvement and inappropriate conduct. But for the first time, Claire heard the world turn toward her, not with accusations, but with questions. That afternoon, Ethan received an ultimatum. Either he stepped down from management temporarily or lost the support of the majority board. He didn't hesitate. Do what you want. I'm not staying silent for you. He walked out of the room, got in his car, and drove to Claire's apartment. No warning, no text, just rang the doorbell, heart in hand. She opened the door slowly. She was pale, with dark circles under her eyes, but steady. You shouldn't be here, she said, without anger. But I am, because silence is what killed my brother. And I won't let that happen with you. Claire hesitated, then opened the door wider. Ethan stepped inside. He looked around the modest living room. Books stacked, lukewarm tea on the table, the blue notebook on the couch. This is destroying something much bigger than a company. It's trying to silence those who lead by example. Claire sat down slowly. The world doesn't change just because someone powerful decides to listen. Ethan sat beside her. But it can start if the one who listens has the courage to keep going even after losing everything. She looked into his eyes. Then, keep going, even if I'm no longer there. Ethan stayed, in silence, like someone who knew there was no right thing to say. Claire, so used to surviving alone, didn't quite know what to do with someone who simply stayed. Not with promises, not with justifications, just with presence. You won't be able to protect everything, she said. I don't want to protect. I want to make things right, even if it costs you your name. I've lived with guilt long enough. Now, I'd rather lose my last name than lose my voice. The next morning, a new report arrived through the internal company channel, this time from an anonymous employee, but with solid proof of who had planted the fake dossier against Claire. Screenshots, bank transfers, and conversations behind the false article. It all pointed to one name, Charles Gibbons, one of the oldest board members and a staunch defender of the old model. Upon receiving the material, Ethan didn't hesitate. He called the press and exposed the truth, documents in hand. The scandal turned. The same media that had pointed fingers at Claire now clamored for an interview. But she declined them. All. I'm not going to speak just to clean my image. I want my actions to speak for me. When asked about rehiring her, Ethan replied, she never should have left. And if she wants to return, her place is still with us. But he knew the invitation was no longer professional. It was a calling to rebuild not just the company, but the bond between them. Claire received the invitation by hand, delivered by a young intern who couldn't hide his excitement. She looked at the paper for long minutes, then picked up her blue notebook, turned to the last page, and wrote. They tried to silence, but they forgot that what is true echoes. She closed the notebook calmly and decided that if she returned, it wouldn't be for revenge. It would be because she still believed in what once gave her the courage to try. Listening changes destinies. When she returned to headquarters, Claire was met with a mix of shy applause and surprised stares. No banners, no official announcement, just her, the blue notebook, and the steps of someone who carries truths instead of ego. When she walked into Ethan's office, he stood up, but she raised her hand. Don't say anything. Not yet. He respected her. I'm not coming back to be a symbol. I'm coming back to keep listening to those who still have no voice. Then, come back as a partner, not a subordinate. Claire smiled. And who said a title changes? Who we are. That very day, Ethan created a new department in the company, the Human Culture Department. A bold name, but he wanted to make a statement. And he appointed Claire as its coordinator. She didn't want glass-walled offices or boardroom tables. She asked for a room with a rug, open windows, and an extra chair for anyone who just wanted to be heard. And that's how it began. The subtle revolution, made of listening, of notebooks, of silences turned into action. The company changed. Gently, Slowly, but it changed. Reports began to include human experiences. Meetings began with questions about what no one was saying. Some laughed, others resisted. But amid it all, Claire and Ethan started writing, with small gestures, a story that wasn't in any leadership manual. A story built on presence and on admiration growing where there once were only walls. One afternoon, after an internal presentation, Ethan invited Claire up to the rooftop. The wind blew strong, and the sun began to set between the buildings. "Do you still think I'm scared?" he asked. She paused for a moment. "I think you're less, but still fighting ghosts that aren't yours." He stepped closer. "What if I want to start over with someone who sees all of me?" Claire smiled, unhurried. "Then find me where speeches end and actions begin." They stood there, side by side, in silence. No touch, no kiss, but something stronger, permanence. The kind of connection that isn't shouted to the world but builds deep roots. Claire knew there would still be challenges. That corporate culture wouldn't change in a month. But she also knew that, beside Ethan, she could be who she truly was. And that was the start of something rare. Something that could, indeed, become love. But above all, was respect. That night, Claire wrote in her notebook, "They tried to make me invisible, but he saw me." Ethan, in his office, held the same notebook, now with a digital copy in the internal system as a symbol of the company's new code of conduct. He knew everything was still fragile, but for the first time, he wanted to stay. Changes at Montgomery Enterprises were becoming visible. The Human Culture Project was gaining momentum, and Claire's presence had become a new axis for decisions that once were based solely on numbers. But behind the scenes, resistance was growing. Ethan, increasingly involved, ignored his advisor's warnings about the risks of exposing himself too much. It was as if, in trying to save the new company he dreamed of building with Claire, he was forgetting that he was still living inside the old one. And she could feel it by in the hallways. The whispers grew louder. Not about Claire's ethics, but about her supposed closeness to the CEO. Too much influence. Promoted for personal reasons. She gives more orders than most directors. Words no one dared to say aloud, yet they echoed. Claire pretended not to hear, but she knew, and Ethan didn't notice, or pretended not to. Maybe because, for the first time, he was being driven by something beyond logic. And that feeling, however genuine, could destroy everything. If not handled with maturity. One afternoon, after a meeting, Claire asked Ethan to stay behind. The room was empty, the tension thick. "You need to stop speaking for me," she said, straight to the point. "I was defending you, and that only exposes me more. I can't let them attack you again. Ethan, I'm not fragile, and if you keep protecting me in public, that's exactly how I'll be perceived." Silence. She wasn't angry, but she was disappointed, and he didn't know how to fix it. "I never meant to silence you," he said quietly. "But that's what's happening. People used to listen to me. Now they look at me like I'm under your wing." Ethan stood up and walked to the window. I'm afraid they'll do to you what they did to my brother." Claire stepped closer. "Then, listen to me. Really listen." He turned to her, eyes glistening. "I lost Lucas because I stayed silent. Because I didn't show up when he needed me most. I couldn't bear to lose you the same way." Claire held back the urge to hug him. She knew he was completely unguarded in that moment. But she also knew her role there was different. "You won't lose me by letting me be who I am. You'll lose me if you try to reshape me to fit in a place that was never mine." Ethan nodded, almost in pain. "I've never loved someone who challenged me," she answered softly, "and I've never let anyone love me without hearing me fully." In the days that followed, Claire stepped back quietly. She continued working but avoided coffees, one-on-one meetings, and presence-laden moments. Ethan felt her absence more than he expected. Everything seemed colder, harder. He realized he had relied too heavily on her presence, not as a woman, but as his compass. And now, without that compass, everything felt disoriented. He thought of reaching out to her, but for the first time, he understood he needed to stay silent and wait for her to choose to stay. Claire, meanwhile, returned to the lower floors. She needed to remind herself why she had started all this. She talked to overlooked employees, listened to unheard stories, wrote down wounds that hadn't yet healed. And there, far from the spotlight, and from Ethan, she found something she had almost lost, her own truth. She wasn't there for him. She was there for everything he still didn't know how to hold. And only when he learned that, would she truly be able to stay at the project's headquarters, a mural began to draw attention. Employees left anonymous notes about listening, respect, and transformation. One caught Claire's eye. Those who don't learn to listen risk losing everything silence tries to build. She recognized the handwriting. It was Ethan's. And for the first time in days, she smiled. He was trying, not with words, but with silent presence. And that meant more than any apology. At the end of that week, Claire received a notification. Ethan had canceled his keynote speech at the company's annual event and nominated her to take his place. She hesitated. Was it just another exposure? Or a gesture of trust? She called him. Are you sure about this? His voice was calm. I'm learning to step out of the center and truly listen. Claire closed her eyes. Then I'll be there. And she knew that this time, she wouldn't speak only for herself, but for everyone who had never been heard. On the day of the event, Claire walked on stage holding the blue notebook. No slides, no charts, just stories of real people, of voices that helped the company grow without ever being called by name. And at the end, she read a single line. Love, when it's real, doesn't appear on stage. It stays in the silence, holding what matters, even when no one applauds. And then, without meaning to, her eyes found Ethan's in the audience. He didn't clap right away. He simply stood, present, exactly how she had always known he could be. After the event, Claire slipped out quietly through the back. She wasn't looking for praise. She didn't want the spotlight. But she found Ethan waiting by the emergency exit, like someone who knew she wouldn't accept applause, but might accept honest eyes. You were extraordinary, he said, not stepping too close. She smiled, restrained. I just said what I always needed to hear. And you taught me what I needed to learn. A heavy silence formed between them, like a bridge waiting to be crossed. I failed you, Ethan began, without hesitation. Claire lifted her eyes. Not for wanting to protect me, but for forgetting that I'm not someone who needs to be defended. She nodded. I know. I let fear of losing you take over, and almost lost you by not trusting you could stand on your own. She took a deep breath, and I stepped back to remember that my strength doesn't rely on your validation. They both knew. This wasn't an ending, but it wasn't a restart either. I don't want you to stay for me, he said. And I don't stay for you, she replied. Ethan gave a faint smile, recognizing that this only made him admire her more. But I do want to build something with you. Claire looked at him with a shine in her eyes that blended resistance and tenderness. Then we need to stop trying to save each other and start walking side by side. He nodded. That was exactly it. And only now did he truly understand. The following days were quieter. Ethan reduced public appearances. Claire resumed her project routine, with more listening and less exposure. They still crossed paths in the hallways, meetings, coffee breaks, but without urgency. There was something more mature, more stable, as if both knew that real love doesn't grow in impulse, but in respect. And for the first time, they were learning to respect even each other's timing. One night, Claire was walking through the nearly empty building when she found Ethan in the old HR office. He was in rolled-up sleeves, barefoot, rearranging furniture. What are you doing here? Turning this room into a new listening space for employees. She smiled, surprised. You personally? After everything you taught me, it feels like the least I can do. Claire stepped in. Then let's move these desks together. They dragged chairs, rolled out rugs, and hung simple pictures. They talked about everything, except themselves. It was as if, in that moment, the connection lived in the gestures. Ethan wasn't trying to impress. Claire wasn't trying to protect herself. They simply were, and that was enough. When they finished, they sat side by side on the floor. Can I tell you something? He asked. Of course. I was afraid that, by opening a space for listening, I'd have to be heard too. She looked at him calmly. And now? Now? I think I'm finally ready. Claire grabbed the notebook, opened to a blank page, and placed it between them. Then start here. Ethan picked up a pen. He wrote slowly, in silence. When he finished, he turned the notebook toward her. It read, I hear you, even when you say nothing. Claire said nothing. She simply smiled. And that was the deepest conversation they had ever had. The next morning, the room they had inaugurated received its name. The Permanence Room. No grand event. No speech. just a plaque on the door with one of Claire's quotes. It's not the strength of speech that transforms. It's the courage to listen to what no one wants to hear. Employees began visiting the room. Some just sat, some cried, some laughed, but all were finally heard. And Ethan, almost daily, would pass by, not as the CEO, but as someone who was still learning. One of those days, Claire found a small box on her desk with a dried leaf inside. Beside it, a note read, "Not every tree blooms right away, but the one that listens to the wind remains." She closed her eyes for a moment. She no longer needed certainty, because what she and Ethan were building was no longer made of promises. It was made of roots, and roots know what to do with time. That night, Claire wrote in her notebook, "He didn't try to save me. He learned to walk beside me. And that's why now, I can choose to stay." When Ethan read those words on the internal project mural, he didn't search for a response. He simply smiled, because for the first time, he understood listening to someone all the way through is the rarest and most intimate act of love. And he was ready to love that way. Montgomery Enterprises had never been so quiet, and paradoxically, never so alive. The permanence room had become the symbolic heart of the company's new culture. But it wasn't just about the room itself. It was what it represented, a place where one could pause, breathe, be. And in that new rhythm, Ethan and Claire grew closer with each passing day. No rush, no spotlight, just through gestures, because they had learned what's true doesn't need to prove itself. It just needs to stay. Claire now led a small team that monitored employee well-being. Her office was simple, filled with books, plants, and an old coffee maker. But it was the most visited room in the company. People who had never even been called by name were now welcomed with tea, attention, and eyes that truly listened. Sometimes Ethan would sit on the sofa beside her with no agenda, just to observe, or listen, or let himself be slowly transformed by someone who never asked for anything except presence. One morning, Claire arrived and found an envelope taped to her door. Inside was a small plant, rooted in an old ceramic mug. A note read, "For the space that turned noise into listening. May what the world tried to silence bloom here." No signature, but she recognized the handwriting. And she understood. Ethan no longer said, "I feel." He showed it. The following week, Ethan launched a new initiative called Invisible Voices, allowing any employee to share ideas directly with the executive team, unfiltered. During the announcement, he paused and invited Claire on stage. "This wasn't my idea. It was something I heard." And he handed her the microphone. But Claire simply smiled and declined. Some changes speak for themselves. And the audience understood. The revolution didn't need a speech. It was already happening. Despite their closeness, they still avoided labels. Ethan hadn't said, "I like you." Claire hadn't said, "I miss you." But their eyes did. So did their silences. One late afternoon, they shared a quiet coffee on the company's terrace. The sun was setting between buildings. "Sometimes I think about how all this began," Ethan said. Claire looked out at the horizon, with a notebook, and someone who chose not to stay silent. He smiled, and someone who finally had the courage to listen. Then, without warning, Ethan pulled a small new notebook from his pocket. Black cover, compact size. "I've started writing too," he said, a little shy. Claire took it gently and flipped through it. There were scattered phrases, reflections, quotes from her, and at the end, a firm note. "She taught me that silence isn't absence. It's a choice." Claire closed the notebook slowly. "You didn't have to give me this. I know, but I wanted you to see that I've learned." The next day, Claire invited him to visit a public school that partnered with their project. He hesitated, not for lack of time, but for fear of not knowing who he was without his title. "There, no one will call you CEO. And what if I don't know how to act?" "Then just listen." Ethan went, and as he listened to children share their dreams for the future, he saw his brother Lucas in every pair of hopeful eyes, shining despite the pain. And he knew Claire had brought him back to his own beginning. On the way back, they walked together down a tree-lined street. Claire stopped in front of an old bookstore. "This was my first job," she said. "You sold stories? I listened to dreams. And now, I still listen, just with more responsibility." He looked at her, full of tenderness. "And, do you listen to yourself?" She smiled. "I'm learning." Ethan started leaving short notes inside books on her desk. Highlighted passages, Underlined quotes. No signature, but the gesture was unmistakably his. Claire responded by posting small notes on the bulletin board in his office. It was as if they were getting to know each other from the edges. No declarations, just breadcrumbs of truth scattered in silence. And for both, that was more intimate than any label could be. Point 1 Rainy Friday. Claire stayed late at the office. As she was about to leave, she heard a sound from the rooftop. She went up and found Ethan alone, sitting under the glass canopy, listening to instrumental music. "Stay a while?" he asked without looking. She sat beside him. "Why do you always come here?" "Because here, the world fits inside." The silence. Claire closed her eyes for a moment. "Then tonight, I'll just stay." And she did. The rain tapped gently against the glass roof, filling the silence with a calm, steady rhythm. Claire watched the droplets slide down the surface, as if they were washing away the hurry, the pressure, the noise of the world. Ethan sat beside her, elbows on his knees, eyes on the gray horizon. Neither of them needed to fill the silence with words, because they already knew. Some presences heal more than any long conversation. And that night was silent healing for both. "Do you still feel guilty?" Claire asked suddenly, not turning her head. Ethan took his time to answer. "Every day? For the company I ignored. For the brother I lost. For everything I failed to do out of fear." She took a deep breath. "Guilt is only worth something if it becomes a bridge, not a wall." He looked at her, sincere. "And you're helping me cross it." Claire simply nodded. And that was enough. The next day, Ethan called a closed meeting with senior management. He presented data from the new program, real stories of internal transformation, and a bold proposal to include frontline employees in strategic decision-making. The board hesitated. It was unconventional, risky, but Ethan spoke with clarity. "If you still think listening is weakness, then maybe you're in the wrong place." Claire watched from afar, and for the first time, saw someone say, out loud, what she had always wished to. A symbolic gesture. The board suggested Claire receive an award for human-centered leadership. She declined. "I'm not here to receive applause. I'm here to ensure no one has to be extraordinary just to be heard." But she accepted a different kind of tribute, a community reading room named Claire Bennett Space, where ideas take root. At the opening, Claire held back tears. Ethan hugged her gently. "You're not a symbol. You're a seed." That night, as she finished reports, Claire found an envelope taped to her screen. Inside, a white sheet with a handwritten sentence. "You taught me how to love without words." She held the note carefully, as if holding something fragile. And then, for the first time, she wrote back. A simple note. "And you taught me that love sometimes begins when someone finally listens, all the way through." She left it on his desk and walked away, knowing something had shifted, without a speech, without noise. Just shifted. The company's mural began filling with anonymous stories. People shared experiences of being heard, moments of overcoming, reconnections. Ethan read them all. So did Claire. One note read, "He came down from the top floor and saw who I was." Claire recognized the feeling, because she too had been seen. And that was rarer than any title could offer. Point 1 afternoon, Claire entered Ethan's office unannounced. Found him bent over his new notebook. "Writing about me again?" She teased with a smile. "About you, about me, about what we're becoming." She walked closer. "And what are we becoming?" Ethan looked up, serious but tender. A story told without rushing. And without fear. He took a deep breath. "I'm working on that. At the end of that week, the company welcomed a group of teens from a partner social project. Claire and Ethan led the visit together. She spoke about choices. He spoke about listening. One teenager raised his hand and asked, "Are you two a couple?" Silence. Glances exchanged. Claire answered sweetly, "Not yet. But maybe. We're learning how to build something that's meant to last." And the group smiled. Because somehow, they knew what was being born. There was love. Even if no one had said the word yet. That night, at the top of the building, Claire and Ethan looked out at the illuminated city. She rested her head on his shoulder for the first time. "I don't need you to say anything. I know. But when the time comes, I'll be ready." And they stayed there, without urgency, because they knew this wasn't just the start of a romance. It was the beginning of a new kind of presence. In the blue notebook, Claire wrote, "Between the world's noise and the silence of listening, we found each other." Ethan, reading the note days later, drew a small heart in the corner of the page. They hadn't kissed yet, hadn't made any declarations, but they already loved each other. In the rarest way, with truth, with listening, and with time. Here is the final continuation of your translation, preserving the emotional depth, cinematic atmosphere, and poetic cadence. The calm didn't last. Major changes always provoke reactions, and this time, they came from where Ethan least expected, the company's international division, where investors began to question the excessive humanization in management. Confidential documents were leaked, distorting the actions of the Invisible Voices project. Images of Ethan and Claire at internal events were taken out of context, insinuating personal favoritism. In just a few days, what had been a model became a target. The news spread like wildfire. Sensationalist headlines, twisted opinions, harsh analyses. Ethan was summoned to a meeting with the shareholders. "They want you to step down from the presidency," said one of the board members. "And if I refuse, the company could be sold, broken apart." Ethan felt the old fear creeping back in, the fear of losing everything. But this time, what he feared most was hurting Claire. She found out through others. She was at a workshop with public school teachers when she received a brief call. "Get ready. They're going to use your name to weaken you." Claire hung up, fell silent, then calmly closed her folder and ended the event. Inside, she was trembling, not for herself, but for everything they were building. Everything born from the subtle, now being shattered by noise. And she knew Ethan would do what he believed was right, but she would also have to do what was just. That night, he showed up at her door. He didn't say anything right away. She stepped aside to let him in. "They want me to step down. And will you?" "Not for me. For you." Claire took a deep breath. "If you go, let it be because you believe it's the right path. I just don't want them to use you to get to me." She looked him straight in the eye. "Then, for once, don't pull me off the front lines. Walk with me." But Ethan hesitated. The fear was stronger than he wanted to admit. And in a miscalculated move, he began to withdraw from her quietly. He canceled joint meetings, postponed visits to projects, ignored her messages, all in an attempt to protect her, and, ironically, hurt her more with each absence. Claire noticed. She said nothing, but the silence between them returned. Not the kind that listens, the kind that distances, the kind that once hinted at love, and now felt like absence dressed as cautioned. "You're shutting me out," she said, days later, in the middle of an empty hallway. "I'm trying to shield you. You're silencing me. I'm protecting you. You're hurting me." He lowered his eyes. Claire went on. "I taught you to listen. But now, you're afraid to hear even me." Ethan felt guilt rise like fever. Because she was right. That night, Claire didn't go home. She traveled alone to the old bookstore where she had once worked. She ordered a coffee, sat at the same table, and opened the blue notebook. She wrote, "He pulled me off the battlefield without asking if I wanted to leave." She looked around. The walls smelled of paper and time. There, she remembered who she was before being seen. And she knew she couldn't let love become an excuse for silencing, nor let care be used as a form of control. Meanwhile, Ethan walked through the empty company building, past the spaces he had built with her. The permanence room was silent. A handwritten anonymous note lay on the table. "Those who only listen when it's easy have never truly listened." He sat down, hands over his face, and he understood. In trying to protect her, he had repeated the very mistake that had driven him from his brother. Fear disguised as care, absence disguised as love, and maybe he was losing Claire just as he'd lost Lucas, through omission. The next morning, Claire received an offer from another organization to lead a national-level listening project. A prestigious, ethical, and real opportunity. Something she had always dreamed of. But her heart ached. Because it wasn't just a new chance, it also felt like a quiet ending. A path Ethan wouldn't walk, not in the way she needed. She spent the day in doubt. She didn't tell him. She waited for him to listen. But he never showed that it was only at the end of the day that Ethan found out. About the offer, the opportunity, the decision. He ran through the halls until he found her standing outside the room where it had all begun. "You're leaving?" he asked, breathless. "I wasn't called to run, Ethan. I was called to remain in myself. And in us. We only exist when we listen together. And you didn't listen." He felt his world crumble again. But now, there were no excuses, Claire was steady, but not cold. It hurt, of course. She had believed Ethan was ready to walk beside her, but at the first storm, he had retreated behind his walls. I never asked for guarantees, Ethan, but I wanted to shield you. Love doesn't shield. Love sustains. He fell silent. She breathed deeply. Maybe the cruelest thing isn't being silenced, but being forgotten the moment truth becomes uncomfortable. That night, she left an envelope at his office door. Inside, a single sheet from the blue notebook with one last sentence. If listening is only beautiful in speeches, then silence will always win. And she left. No dramatics, no promises, just the dignity of someone who knows her worth, even when the other still doesn't know how to honor it. Ethan spent hours staring at that sheet. His heart tightened, like the air had vanished from the entire floor. For the first time there were no advisors, no strategies, just pain and longing and regret. He remembered everything they had built together, not with words, but with gestures, and he realized he was about to destroy it not because he didn't love her, but because of fear. And fear, when it leads, always silences what's most true. So he did what he had never done. He asked for help. He sought out the employees Claire had trained, listened to their stories, read their notes. He returned to the permanence room and asked to be heard like any other employee. He sat down, removed his ID badge, and spoke. About Lucas, about fear, about Claire, about how learning to listen hadn't made him weaker, but more human. At the end, he left a message on the mural. If she still believes, I'll stay. And this time, not to save anyone, but to love her right. The next morning, the city awoke to a video posted on the company's internal channel. It was Ethan in a close-up shot, no title, no corporate backdrop. Just him, sitting, eyes steady. I stayed silent when I should have listened. Again, he told Claire's story, her courage, the changes she led, the choice she made, and the one he hadn't had the courage to make. But if there's one thing she taught me, it's that there's still time. If you listen all the way through. He concluded, Claire, if there's still space, I want to stay. Claire watched the video sitting at that same table in the old bookstore. Tears streamed down easily. It wasn't the public apology. It was the humility. He no longer wanted to be a hero. He just wanted to love with truth. She took a breath, called him. Are you still willing to walk with me? Even if the path isn't beautiful? I've already started walking. I was just waiting for you to look back. Claire smiled. Then come back. But come as yourself. Not as the CEO. For the first time, I want to be just Ethan. They met again in the permanence room. No cameras. No rehearsed lines. He walked in slowly. She was waiting, seated, the blue notebook in her lap. I brought this back, she said, handing him the page with the last line. I don't deserve it. But you learned. He smiled, eyes wet. Can we start from zero? She held out her hand. We can continue from where the listening stopped. The following week, Claire declined the offer from the new organization, not out of fear of leaving, but because she understood her mission there wasn't over yet. She didn't stay for Ethan. She stayed for herself, and for everyone who still hadn't been heard. Ethan returned to the company's leadership, not as someone who leads from above, but from within. The project expanded. Listening became culture, and their love became routine. The quiet kind, but so present that no one could pretend not to notice. One night, on the rooftop, they sat side by side like so many times before. Claire leaned her head on his shoulder. We almost lost each other, but we found each other in what remained. And what remained? What silence couldn't erase. She smiled. Then may we keep choosing to stay. Every day, even on the days it hurts. Especially on those. Claire wrote in the notebook. He came back, not as a hero, but as a man who learned to listen all the way through. Ethan read it days later, saying nothing. He just hugged her from behind, gently resting his face against hers. They still didn't know exactly what to call it, but they knew what they felt. And above all, they knew it was love. The kind that listens, the kind that stays, the kind that endures to the end. The Montgomery Enterprises building was calmer that morning, but it was a different kind of silence, not one of omission, but of attention. It felt as if everything was breathing in harmony. The Invisible Voices project had spread through all the branches, and at the center of it all, Claire Bennett remained herself. She didn't seek control. She didn't care about titles. She simply stayed. And that, little by little, changed the world around her without her needing to impose. Ethan often watched her from a distance. He still got emotional seeing her listen to someone as if they were the only person in the world. He, who once believed leadership meant giving orders, now understood. To lead is to listen. With your soul point one afternoon, he stepped quietly into her office. I'm organizing a thank you ceremony for the employees of the year. Claire looked up, a bit suspicious. With cake, speeches, and applause. With roots, silence, and presence. She smiled. Then maybe I'll show up. The day of the event came. Instead of a stage, there was an indoor garden decorated with dry leaves, books, wooden benches, and a tree planted in the center, a symbol of staying. Employees sat on cushions on the floor. There was no microphone, just a table with warm tea, blank notebooks, and pens to AT the start. Ethan stood and said just a few words. Today isn't about who speaks, it's about who always listened, even when no one else did. And then, to Claire's surprise, he called her to the center, not as a guest of honor, but as a living symbol of everything that transformed that place. She walked slowly, wore dark jeans, a light blouse, and held the blue notebook in her hands. I didn't prepare anything, she said simply. Even better, someone whispered. From the audience, Claire took a deep breath, because what needed to be said has already been lived. And in that moment, no one dared to interrupt. I started here invisible, she continued. I learned to hear what no one saw. And to write down what no one said. I held onto this notebook for years, hoping that maybe one day someone would listen. Today I understand. Those who truly listen don't wait to be seen. They listen because they know that the voices from the ground are what hold up the top. And if you're sitting in this garden today, it's because someone, somewhere, dared to stay. Ethan watched with teary eyes, not from guilt, but from admiration. For the first time, he didn't want to interfere, didn't want to rescue, guide, or shine. He just wanted for her to be, because she, by herself, was already everything. When Claire finished, there was no applause, there was silence. And in that silence, there was listening, and listening, in that context, was the highest form of reverence to AT the end of the event. Every employee received a small plant with a note written by Claire. Hers was left on the central table, written in firm handwriting. Plant what you want to remain. Because what's true takes root. Many cried. Others smiled in silence. But everyone understood this wasn't a goodbye. It was a legacy. And Ethan, sitting beneath the tree's shade, knew that this was the moment, not just to look at her, but to walk toward her fully. Later, he found her alone, gathering the notebooks left by employees. You were heard. All the way to the end. For the first time, without needing to prove anything, Ethan stepped closer. Claire, she looked at him, calm. I never asked you to say anything, but I kept everything you never said. She smiled. And what? Did you hear? He pulled a small piece of paper from his pocket. On it, a handwritten sentence. I love you. Not for what you did for me, but for who you were, even when I didn't yet know how to be. Claire closed her eyes for a moment, then held his face in her hands. And now do you know? I do. Then say nothing else. And she kissed him. For the first time, it was a quiet kiss, unhurried. Like two people who had already said everything through their actions. Like those who only needed to confirm that silence can love too. Passing employees smiled discreetly. It wasn't a spectacle. It wasn't a show. It was recognition of two worlds that didn't collide by fate, but by decision. And who chose not to run, but to listen to each other and stay. After the event, Claire and Ethan walked the company's hallways side by side, as if nothing needed to be hidden or proven. People saw them and, instead of whispers, offered discreet smiles, looks of respect. Their relationship wasn't born from status or intentions. It was born from listening, from staying, from truth. And that changed everything around them. Because when love is quiet, it teaches, even without trying. Months passed. Montgomery Enterprises was recognized as one of the most human-centered companies in the country. Not because of its profits, but because of its culture. And at the heart of it all, there was a simple room with a worn-out couch, a bookshelf, and a wall covered in notes. That's where Claire spent her mornings. Listening. No tie, no gold badge, just her cup of tea, and the blue notebook. Which now? She shared with Ethan. Yes, he wrote in it too. And not just decisions, but doubts, fears, memories. Claire read silently and replied in notes, doodles, short poems that it was a conversation that needed no voice. And maybe that's why it was more intimate than any spoken dialogue. They lived like that in the constant exchange between what they felt and what they were still learning to name. Because their love didn't ask for urgency, it asked for listening. One afternoon, Ethan took Claire to a new room in the building's basement. When he opened the door, she saw low bookshelves, colorful rugs, and drawings made by children. What is this? A community library, open to the public, inspired by the place where you started. She looked around, moved. Who chose the name? He pointed to the small sign. Clear Roots, where listening is the beginning of everything. And Claire, for the first time, cried without holding back. The library's inauguration, neither of them gave a speech. They let the children read notes collected over the months. One read, "She listened to me when no one else remembered I existed." Another, "He learned to listen, and that's why I started dreaming again." And finally, a small girl with bright eyes read, "Listening to someone is a way of saying, you matter." And everyone knew this was about Claire and Ethan, and about all who dared to stay. That night, the two walked back to the building together. The sky was clear. The air was light. Claire held Ethan's hand with quiet strength. "We made it," he said. "No rush. No promises, but with truth." He stopped in front of her. "Do you still write in the notebook?" "Every day." "Can I read it?" "You can, but only if you read to the very last page." She handed him the now-worn blue notebook, stained with tea, wind, and time. He flipped to the final page. There it was, written in firm strokes and calm lines. "You listened to me all the way to the end. And that's why I stayed." Ethan closed the notebook slowly, placed his hand over hers. "And so did I." Claire smiled. They didn't say, "I love you" again. They didn't have to. The next day, a new wall was installed in the company's main hall. It was called What Remains. All employees could leave notes about what they had learned, about listening, courage, and truth. The first note was anonymous, but everyone knew who wrote it. Love begins when someone truly listens and stays, even when leaving would be easier. Claire and Ethan didn't get married right away, nor did they post public declarations, but they were seen building a greenhouse together behind the partner school and planting lavender in the listening garden. They were seen arriving together, sometimes holding hands, other times in silence, but always side by side. Because for them, love wasn't what you said to it was what you did and what you upheld, even on hard days. On the last note written in the blue notebook, Claire wrote, "He was the first to truly listen to me to the end, and the last I chose to stay." Ethan found the page days later and drew a heart in the corner, as he always did, then wrote beside it, "You taught me that listening is love, and that's why I listen to you every single day." And so, between unspoken words, full silences, and true presence, Claire and Ethan kept going, together and permanent. If this story touched your heart, comment below. Listening is choosing to stay. Like this video so more people can discover the power of true listening. Share it with someone who once truly heard you, even when no one else did. And if you believe that the strongest love is the one that listens in silence, subscribe to this channel for more stories that heal, inspire, and stay. Here, every story is a reminder that you matter.